and welcome to Pluralism and Moral Foundation. This webinar is the third of 5 that comprise Typologies of Interfaith Education, a symposium co-hosted by the Marty Center for the Public Understanding of Religion at the University of Chicago Divinity School and Interfaith Youth Corps, and generously funded by the Henry Luce Foundation. My name is Noah Silverman, and I am the Senior Director of Strategic Partnerships at Interfaith Youth Corps. It has been my distinct honor and pleasure to work with Professor Wilhelmine Otten, Director of the Marty Center and Professor of Theology and the History of Christianity at the Divinity School, along with Rob LeLauren and Ross Allen to plan the symposium. The goal behind the symposium is to strive for greater communication between administrators, students, and scholars from different seminaries and universities, bridging their religious and political divides, by bringing them together for the purpose of developing a more integrated and responsive public approach to interfaith education. As was discussed by David Nurnberg, Dean of the University of Chicago Divinity School, and Ibu Patel, founder and president of Interfaith Youth Corps, at our opening plenary last Monday, the background to the project is the divided way in which interfaith education is currently being taken up. In today's webinar, we will focus on ethics and moral formation and have the pleasure of hearing from an august group of scholars. Before I turn things over to Professor Otten to introduce our panelists, I would like to acknowledge that today is, of course, Martin Luther King Jr. Day. When Wilhelmine and I realized this occasion would be falling in the midst of our symposium, we initially considered avoiding the date, but then we reflected on what a wonderful serendipity it was. The Reverend Dr. King was, among many other things, a true interfaith leader, drawing inspiration from the Hindu leader Mohandas Gandhi and building interreligious relationships and partnerships with many, including the Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and the Buddhist Vietnamese monk Thich Nhat Hanh. Reverend King's legacy offers profound inspiration for today's conversation indeed. Finally, I'd like to inform our attendees that there will be time for an audience Q&A at the end of the webinar. At any time throughout the webinar, please feel free to use the Q&A function in the bottom of your screen to submit questions, and we will attempt to pose as many as possible to our panel before the webinar concludes. We will post everyone's bios in the chat, and perhaps we turn things over to Professor Schweiker of the Div School to begin our conversation.
You will soon receive in the chat the bios by our esteemed columnists. I want to underline again the way in which this panel is uniquely suited for this day in our nation's history, given the interfaith character of the civil rights movement itself. And we all know that our current situation in this country, politically, socially, ethnically, racially, religiously, requires the same kind of diligence, the same kind of care, the same kind of courage that was required during the civil rights movement. Maybe we can turn to Professor Flores to start out the conversation. We've asked each of our panelists to take a few minutes to give their overall orientation to the topic of interfaith education and formation, as well as in relation to ethics. So please.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. And I'll just begin with how I'm entering this conversation. So I am a Catholic who was educated in theological ethics at a Jesuit university, specifically at Boston College. And after Boston College, I joined the faculty at a very small Catholic liberal arts college, St. Anselm College in Manchester, New Hampshire. And then I had the opportunity to join the faculty at the University of Virginia, which of course is not just a public university, but in some ways, maybe I think too highly of our university, it's the flagship public university of our country. And one of the reasons for that is because it was founded, of course, by the third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. And it was founded in a way that Jefferson attempted to keep theology and theological discourse out of the primary work of the university. So people always ask me, how is it that someone who is not just, kind of Catholic or practicing Catholic, but someone who is trained in Catholic theological ethics and spends her mornings at Mass and her evenings saying the Rosary, is now teaching in this public university? How do you go about doing that? And especially, how do you go about doing that without reaching the wall between church and state that Jefferson really wanted to drive home as this guiding image for how we should relate to religion in public life in the United States? And honestly, that challenge enlivens my days. As I can say more about this as we go through the conversation, really the challenge is I find the tension in presenting the material where I have expertise from the Catholic tradition within Catholic theology and Catholic ethics, but doing so in a way that presents it as the contents of a lived faith tradition to my students and colleagues at the University of Virginia, who come from all different religious backgrounds and many from no religious background in particular, and presenting it as one among many conversation partners. So I think I'll stop there for now, but that's really my orienting challenge, at least in my current job and work, is trying to be a Catholic in not just in public life, but in a public university with all the responsibilities that are attendant to that position.
Thank you. Rather than go through, these are renowned scholars. We could do their bibliographies. It would take us till 6, 7 o'clock. So I'm just going to give everybody's renowned titles and then let them jump in. So our next speaker is Hilla Harker, who's the Richard McCormick S.J. Endowed Chair of Catholic Moral Theology at Loyola University here in Chicago. Professor Harker.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Nicole, already for giving us a good start. I think when we talk about moral formations in the context of pluralism and interfaith conversations, we all start with our own biographies. And in my case, that means I was raised in Germany in a very, very Catholic town. And we had the advantage that religious education was formal education in public schools, and there were many venues for kind of encountering religion as a kind of a topical subject area for every student. So religious literacy is a big point for me. But as formalized as it was for me, I was thinking about what are we going to talk about? And it was pretty much boxed in my case. Germany is more or less 50% of the country is Christian, either Catholic or Protestant, and with 45 million people. And the next religion is Islam, and there are only 4.5 million people and 200,000 Jews. And all the other religions are just 1% of the citizenry. And yet, in my moral formation, I would say this, it's not really interfaith, but the German history was so present, we just could not escape it. And so my moral formation is tied to the history of the Nazi time, of course, in two ways. On the one hand side, the disappearance of Jewish life. For example, in my hometown, there had been a synagogue and a Jewish community, and it was completely eradicated by Hitler. The synagogue burned down, and it took the country, and I'm saying that on MLK Day, it took the country 45 years to even get a memorial in my little town. And that is very representative of all over Germany. And yet in my own upbringing, in my education, in religious education especially, the Shoah or the Holocaust was the moral memory we had to go to. Moral remembrance was at the center of our moral formation. And it was always kind of, we were so Christian in my hometown, so Catholic actually, and this wrestling between Christianity and Judaism, that was really nothing that could be pushed into the background. And so for me today, I would say that, yes, we have to talk about the religious, but also the moral literacy. I think I actually, I'm happy that the Christian tradition knows this faith-seeking understanding. And if we talk about interfaith traditions, I wish we will have more occasions to have interfaith-seeking understanding events, venues, and so on. And finally, that's the last point I want to make. I do believe that interfaith conversations cannot just be driven by reason and rational understanding, knowledge, traditions, and so on. Religions have the opportunities to go through aesthetics, whether it is narratives, poetry, rituals, music, arts, and so on. And I do believe that as alien as another religion may be, through the aesthetic forms that cultures have, we might have actually the opportunity to translate our own tradition into another one, but also translate back and become the hosts for another tradition in our own religious tradition. So I stop here, but my hope is that we can bring together kind of a conversation about religious literacy with respect to interfaith conversations, but then also the moral formation through memory and through narratives and aesthetic forms.
Thank you very much. We turn next to Rabbi Rachel Mikva, who is the Herman E. Schulman Professor of Jewish Studies at Chicago Theological Seminary here in Hyde Park.
Oh, thanks so much. Picking up on Hille's comment about the way that history shapes our moral formation, I'd actually like to begin with the land acknowledgement. Although I am based in Chicago, I'm out in Arizona right now on land taken from the Akimel, Odom, and Pipash indigenous peoples, whose care and keeping of these lands preserve their stark beauty. Their descendants are actually my neighbors in the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community. And to the questions at hand around the connection between interfaith education and moral formation, I understand interfaith education as the dynamic encounter between religious traditions and persons of differing life stances, which is a term that some of us use to be more inclusive than religion, and to not define non-religious people by what they're not, etc. But it's not simply learning about, but rather learning alongside people who orient around religion differently. And there are a lot of advantages related to moral formation. Since we are gathering on Martin Luther King Day, I'll start to unpack one of them, beginning with a quote from his letter from Birmingham jail. King wrote, "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." So I think about this quote, people tend to imagine religions as wholly separate from one another, but we're always in a process of co-formation. Our beliefs, our behaviors, our belongings have always taken shape in relationship with one another. Dr. King, of course, was talking about people of diverse races, and he quoted Martin Buber, to lament how segregation limits us to I-it encounters, relegating persons to the status of things. But Buber also taught that the I, the self, can truly develop only in encounter with the thou. So it feels very similar to me to Buddhist teachers Thich Nhat Hanh's concept of interbeing and the Ubuntu philosophy of I am because you are. They're all profound articulations of co-formation. And among the benefits of this process, I would identify that we become more conscious of our own religious particularity, more adept at narrating our journey within it and refining our ideas through that sharpening lens of encounter. We come to understand other ways of being, to develop our capacity for empathy, and to experience differences not only as boundaries, but as meeting places. We gain perspective to view our own spiritual life stance from outside as well as within, to understand how it might impact other people and how to be accountable to them. And as a result, and this is where I'll stop for now, I believe we're more ready and more able to seek out together the common good.
Thank you very much. Our final speaker is Aristotle Papanikolaou, Archbishop Demetrius Chair of Orthodox Theology and Culture, Fordham University, and we welcome you.
Thank you. It's great to be here. It's an honor actually, and so thank you for inviting me. So I'm gonna, in terms of interfaith education, I'm gonna focus on my brief comments on the education part. I mean, when I hear about education, and perhaps it's perhaps a sign of our own particular way of seeing it in this current situation, but when I think of education, I think of education having a certain kind of critical aspect to it, with a goal of seeing otherwise. And I'm an Orthodox Christian, and I taught in an Orthodox Christian seminary in Brookline, Massachusetts, Holy Cross, Greek Orthodox School of Theology. And now I teach at Fordham University, a research university within the Catholic Jesuit tradition. Interfaith education at a seminary or introducing it might be a little bit difficult, especially in an Orthodox Christian seminary. In Fordham, it's somewhat of a given, actually, both in terms of content and in terms of the diverse population that students encounter there. But what I found really interesting is that, and this is just my own experience, in both at the seminary and at Fordham, both seminarians and undergrad students come with certain preconceptions about what religion is, about what being religious is. They often see things through this framework of sort of religion and spirituality, which, you know, as scholars, maybe we can sort of problematize, but is playing a crucial role in terms of how they frame these particular kinds of experiences. So I think, how is it that they see religion, in scare quotes? I think they see it as contractual. I think they see it as membership. I think they see it as a kind of rewards and punishment system. And given that this panel is especially thinking about interfaith education in terms of pluralism and moral formation, I actually think they think formation as a kind of learning what the rules are, and perhaps figuring out a kind of formation to follow the rules. I guess my point to some extent is that they don't really see religion as itself formative, perhaps religion as performative. And maybe we could, through interfaith education, seek certain kinds of analogies to, non-religious ways of being in the world that could help them to see religion in a different kind of way, other than this kind of contractual rewards and punishment system. And I like, personally, my favorite is to analyze the being religious and being part of religious tradition to the arts, to what it means to train to be a dancer or a musician or a painter. and to see it as a kind of becoming. In interfaith education, perhaps the best way to do that is to kind of focus in a little bit more on the mystical traditions that I think are evident in all religious traditions. And I also think that, you know, given that, again, this panel is about pluralism and moral formation, I think that that's the issue at hand. In other words, that to see religion as itself formative and performative is to see that formation and performance in relationship to the inevitable pluralism that we face in the world. And, you know, so if in fact pluralism is an inevitability, right? How is it that that this kind of formation can ultimately negotiate, live within that kind of pluralism, which itself, I think, evokes living in the midst of a certain kind of ambiguity. And I think the kind of formation also would be important to perhaps evoking or realizing a certain kind of contemplative seeing of the truth of the world, especially when that truth includes the kind of systemic racism that we kind of see, that is, well, that we don't necessarily see, that is not so evident, right? And also seeing the truth of perhaps many of the events that obviously we've been seeing over the past week in the United States. Now that formation, again, I think does mean a challenge to figure out how to live in the midst of ambiguity. But I also think, and I'll end here, I also think it does not necessarily mean forfeiting confidence in one's tradition, right? A certain kind of confidence that in fact there's a kind of becoming that is possible and to which many of these religious traditions in fact point to. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank everyone who has spoken. Let me introduce myself now, and just one quick comment, and then I want to make an observation to our panelists and see who wants to pick up on this. My name is William Schweiker. I'm with the Edward L. Ryerson Distinguished Service Professor of Theological Ethics at the University of Chicago. You'll note we all have very long titles. That's important, I guess. One of the things the religions traffic in are claims to truth. And the difficulty is to understand how we ought to properly hold those truths. My own judgment on this, and it reflects what each of the panelists have gone through as well. If you've noticed, each of the panelists has moved from within one specific tradition out to encounter others, whether that be American secularism in Virginia, or in my case, it was working in interfaith in the East End of London, or Hilla's experience in Germany, moving out from the village, Rachel's as well. So we've all, in a sense, lived the journey that we're trying to talk about, which both makes it very relevant and very difficult. How do we hold religious truths? I have my own thoughts on that. I want to pose that as a question to you all, since if we don't engage that question, we're at a lowest common denominator in interfaith education. And then secondly, I was really impressed with the ways you all fashioned different images for the negotiation between traditions or context. The garden in Nicole's comment, rather than walls. History and memory for Hilla. The land and indigenous peoples, as well as networks of interrelationships, and Rachel's comment. And tele-education is a kind of performative art, really, or part of the arts with aesthetic and mystical dimensions. So how do those different images of interreligious education, first of all, is that a fair description? Can you say more about those images? And then how might that relate to the ways in which we, who are committed to interfaith education, bear or carry our own religions? Hope that made sense.
On the question of truth, because interfaith work and interfaith education is sometimes criticized for lowest common denominator religion and promoting relativism. And I think those are separate things. So I think that as a field, both out in the world and in the academy, there's definitely a capacity to dignify difference and not to sort of lump it, say it's all some, different version of the same thing. That doesn't happen. But there is this continuing question that gnaws at a lot of people in the field around truth. But I actually think the focus on truth is misplaced, because they're historical concepts. I think it's too shaped by Cartesian and modern ideas about what truth is, right? Historically, there were concepts that religions are multiple by divine design, right? There's Surah 5 in the Quran about Allah could have made us all the same, but didn't, right? And so live by your path and compete in doing good, not in who's got the true faith, right?
Well, the sad fact is that the history of the world has been the clash of these matters. And if we look at the planet right now, there are clashes, and there are religions who will say, you will know the truth and it will set you free.
Right, so, but there are other conceptions of truth that is not singular, right? And that or that nuance them because humans are authorized to determine interpretation, but have to recognize that it's human. So you have people like Harman Bedain, who says we're looking at what we seek in religion are truths to live by, not absolutes, right? A different way of thinking about truth. Or you have Nicholas de Cusa's
that's why I said how
on Augustine, right? Who's got learned ignorance as a great goal.
That's why I was asking, how do we hold our beliefs?
Yeah.
Precisely.
Well, and
Nicole, please.
That you wrote, Bill, really struck me, and I think this also kind of tries to get to the bottom of this. How do we hold these religious truths? Because as a Catholic in the United States right now, at least even within my parish, I know that I hold some radically different beliefs than the person who's receiving communion next to me. So I think that this question of how we go about asking questions about truth, and especially, at the sunset of a presidency that began with a denial of truth, with, this was the largest inauguration there's ever been in the history of inaugurations. And then have Kellyanne Conway, a couple of weeks later, we have alternative facts. So I think that you both have really wonderful points here, and that, Rachel, you're troubling what we mean by truth in this Cartesian sense, but on the other side, we have to hold, how do we relate our religious beliefs even to, the study of the sciences and in our political environment right now, how we hold these religious truths in relation to what we can see with our own eyes, what we can empirically verify. I think it's a very important question.
Yeah, part of what I was trying to get at is, can there be actual humility in the religious life of not claiming, not because there might not be an absolute truth, I don't know, but how
we're unlikely to have a handle on it.
But how we hold them. Can we hold them with humility, which comes from the Latin humus, from which we get human being in the West? So to be a human being is to hold one might want to argue is to hold things humbly. I'm going on too long. Hilla or Tella, you want to?
Yeah, I would like to jump in because, you know, it really matters through which door we enter the conversation of interfaith religion. And I think historically, you know, I come from the Catholic tradition, and for centuries and centuries it has said there is no salvation outside the Catholic Church. And I cannot deny that I come with this, I call it baggage. Okay, so I'm not raising or the question or responding to your question abstractly, but with this history in mind already. And in my case, for example, I don't know whether that is as popular or classic as it is in the German literature, Gotthold Ephraim Lessing's work, Nathan the Wise Man or something, the Wise, with the three religions coming in three different ways, embracing the same in different languages, in different rituals, in different belief systems, but nevertheless speaking or searching for the same truth. So I wonder, you know, when we talk about religious truth, maybe it is not the first question, but should be the second or third or fourth question rather than the first. When we speak about moral truths, however, I'm becoming a little bit more sensitive, because I do believe I cannot negotiate in my own belief system, let's say. I cannot negotiate torture, for example. I cannot negotiate that, because I, not only for pragmatic or political reasons, but really for foundational moral reasons. And in America especially, we do not like to speak foundational, and we do not like even to say that there is something that is inalienable or insurmountable or so. But, you know, whereas I'm a little bit more willing to go through two or three different doors when it comes to religious truths, and rather exchange narratives and be curious about the different traditions, because they are all so embedded in cultures. When it comes to some normative moral questions, I'm not so flexible. And what does that mean? I do believe that the thorny question of truth and moral truths will always return. Again, I'm arguing for a more experiential approach here, and maybe it is as bad as it is with religious truth to narrow a moral discussion to the question of torture, let's say. But here we are. It is MLK Day, and we're coming out of a year that, for me, has two slogans. The one is the pandemic and COVID-19, but the other is Black Lives Matter. And what does it mean that we say Black lives do not matter? And what is the response then on moral?
All the more so because in the United States, too often religion is identified with morality.
Yeah.
So religion is obviously good, but that is very questionable, as you point out, Hilla. Right? We may need variegated conceptions of truth and decide what is important in terms of interfaith education. Telly.
No, I mean, I think, well, and because Wilhelmine had technical difficulties, it might be good to remind everybody that they can pose questions in the Q&A function at the bottom. So probably everybody has tons of experience with Zoom now to know where to find that. But on the question of truth, I mean, so again, I mean, I think it depends on the one being educated. So the seminarian now, at least in certain seminary contexts, I would say, at least the one I came from, that's the thing that blocks interfaith education for them, because they think that once they take a step towards interfaith education, they're giving up on their truth.
Yeah.
And then the undergrad, I think the fact that in most, I think, higher education contexts, not all, but most, the fact that interfaith education is kind of a given, they ultimately think there is no truth. There is no religious truth. There can be no sense of confidence in any one of these, because ultimately, so for both sides, again, what I find fascinating is that they both have very similar understandings of what truth is, which to some extent frames how they approach this kind of interfaith education. And I'm not sure what the again, not to sound like a broken record, I just think shifting the focus to a certain kind of performative way of understanding, even just being religious, I think is in a way. Now, look, I mean, David Tracy once affectionately chastised me in my oral exam when he said that it's not a real conversation unless you're willing to change your mind. So interfaith education is a conversation. So, I mean, we have to be honest about the fact that once we make that step, yeah, people may change their minds.
Yes.
I think the problem is that most people think that's the only outcome. I mean, that somehow there's a sense of these mutual exclusivities, either orness, dualisms, you have to be on this side or that side. There's a lot
So
of
I teach in a very different seminary context, one that is interreligious, and the students, as you were saying in your first remarks, Telly, they really are, confident in the ability of their path to be transformative for them. And they enter into religious space, yes, to be changed, but not about what they think about their own faith necessarily, but rather what they may think about you and somebody else and their faith, right? Because they entered that space knowing a lot less, understanding a lot less. So, they're not worried about the idea that meeting difference will somehow weaken their faith. They definitely enter this space thinking it will deepen their faith. And nonetheless, I find your analysis around performative versus formative to be a really lovely play on words. And I think that going back to Bill's comments about, can we enter this space humbly? I think the answer is that's the whole idea. I mean, our traditions have these self-critical capacities.
Yes.
And they invite us to enter these spaces humbly, whether it be Nicholas of Cusa's learned ignorance, or in fact, to recognize that no idea has always meant what we think it means. So even there's no salvation outside the church when it was first taught was about people who identified as Christians couldn't have salvation unless they agreed to the hierarchical structures of the church. They couldn't be Christians without the church. It didn't mean what we now think it is, that you have to be Christian in order to find salvation. And salvation itself is not necessarily the goal of every faith, nor is truth.
Very good. Can we use your picking up on that as a segue into connecting, unless you all don't find this interesting, the various images you all introduced, from the garden to memory and aesthetics, networks, land, performative. How do those terms help us to break out of some of the wooden ways of thinking about interfaith education into a more vibrant and humble and probative understanding and respectful?
I would like to add an image here, and that is the image of a movement, because I do believe honestly we have so many problems in this country and globally and internationally right now that we need all of us. And I have encounters with and have joined sometimes the Poor People's Campaign, and I've never in my life seen such a strong movement that is interfaith, respectful, but not humble, but bold. That's the other side, bold with respect to fighting for something and not just against something. Very bold in the fight against poverty or for the well-being and the dignity of human people and human just ordinary individuals who just want to get along in their lives. And I do believe that, you know, one can be in a fortress, as Nicole says, yeah, or in a garden. One can, you know, reflect upon all these metaphors. But let me just add the one of the movement that defines maybe the interfaith connection. Because, oh, let's say I take the image of the chain that connects people in a common movement towards fighting for something.
Very good.
I guess,
Kelly,
I
please.
mean, yeah, Bill, I mean, you kind of mentioned this before, but I mean, the fighting for something. So again, in the sort of the Orthodox Christian world, internationally, globally, you know, there's a new phrase being coined called the new ecumenism. And so, you know, for those of you who know the Orthodox Christian world, I mean, they've been involved in the ecumenical movement, an interfaith movement of a kind. And yet, you know, there have been resistance to that. And especially after the fall of communism, there's been greater resistance to it. And all of a sudden, there's a new ecumenism, which ultimately is forming alliances globally, even with American evangelicals, in order to support what's called traditional values. And so, and obviously there was a kind of new ecumenism of sorts operative last week as well at the Capitol.
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting because maybe I'm getting a little off topic, but it's interesting because people were marveling at sort of the Christian symbols being used and sort of Christian nationalism, and in the Orthodox world, there's nothing new about that. There's lots of symbols like that, and there's even evidence of Orthodox Christian groups supporting dictatorships in Greece in 1967, and so there's all kinds of experiences like that. I guess what I'm trying to get at, to some extent, is I think everybody on this panel has agreed that we want a kind of interfaith education, a kind of interfaith formation that is not seeing the world in those kinds of mutually exclusive, dualistic, either-or categories. That there is a kind of set of practices, perhaps, that we need to kind of see across religious traditions and even beyond religious traditions that perhaps can form us in ways that, again, allow us to be confident in a certain way of becoming in the world, but also affirms, you know, pluralism, sees the world in terms of the kinds of racial injustices that we see there, etc. So I don't really know how to solve that problem except to just admit here on this panel that we want an interfaith education of a certain type, and that, to some extent, I think that has to be linked in a way to the truth claims that you're talking about, Bill, also to a certain set of practices that ultimately allow us to again have a kind of certain confidence amidst the ambiguity.
Let me throw this out. I mean, I'm picking up on what Hill has said on 2 points. I mean, don't we want an interface kind of education which shows that when someone is poor and starving or being tortured, you have a responsibility to do something. And it doesn't have anything to do with whether they're Orthodox, Jew, Muslim, Catholic, heaven forbid, Protestant, that there's a human claim that the religions are, and I think that's important in our current global context.
Well,
I just throw that out.
Backtrack
Nicole?
a little bit to, and maybe try to connect those threads there, because we've all kind of, in one way or the other, made a claim for the need for engaging aesthetics in moral formation, which I'm all about. If you look at my bio over on the side in your chat box over there, my first book is called The Aesthetics of Solidarity. So I'm all in on this, but I also want to trouble the waters here, because I think that the way that the language of aesthetics gets kind of bandied about makes it you know, oh, it's all about beauty, but we don't really talk about the way that aesthetics can negatively form us. So this new ecumenism that Kelly is describing is an aesthetic solidarity. It's an aesthetic of a sea of red hats that we've been seeing for all of these years, as Trumpism has been on the rise. And there are, you know, I'm here in Charlottesville, or I'm 20 minutes outside of Charlottesville, but, you know, we have this aesthetic solidarity of tiki torches. And, you know, this mundane symbol that was appropriated in this I would argue, radically evil, immoral way, unjust way. And so we have to start asking ourselves, and this is a question that really drives my own thinking, you know, how do we think about justice in relation to these questions, justice in relation to aesthetics? And, you know, there's some aesthetic theology people who will, you know, disagree with me and say, oh, you can't reduce aesthetics to ethics. I don't want to do that, but I also don't want aesthetics to lose sight of questions about justice. And I think that's kind of where one element of this conversation about moral formation and pluralism is, are we going to have, and this gets back to our earlier conversation, are we going to allow ourselves to have the really tough conversations about what is justice? And who gets to decide? And are we just going to go with the classic definition, or, you know, does our common thinking about this need to change in some way? And if we don't have that conversation, then of course there are going to be these, you know, groups that form in a new aesthetic ecumenism that abuse these signs and symbols.
Yes, I take it you're actually going the opposite way, in a sense of saying, let's don't reduce ethics to aesthetics, which is the usual move.
Yeah, I think that's
yeah.
So there are clearly lots of different things that build bridges, right? So a moral cause, a cause of justice will be one of those things, and will come together, whether it be through Green Faith or the Parliament of the World's Religions, or Religions for Peace, or Interfaith Worker Justice, or the Interfaith Youth Corps, or United Religions Initiative, or right, the infrastructure of interreligious justice-oriented work is substantial, and we self-select, right? So we pick our cause that we think A is important to us, and B furthers our vision of justice. But I think one of the fundamental questions you're raising, Nicole, is, does an engagement with difference at all advance our capacity to discern together and to push each other on what do we mean when we're talking about justice? What does that look like? And what do we do when we meet somebody's justice that looks really different than ours? And I do think that the practice of meeting over difference builds those muscles, right? But right now, political, or what Helly was talking about in terms of moral, right? What are our moral foundations? These are the things that are not negotiable. This is, you know, what is ultimate and hardest for us to navigate across difference these days.
We had another image there, bridge, which is very good. And I think one of the things that's emerging, and part of the reason why I signaled this, is there is no one image for how to do interfaith education. And the desire to reduce it to one, whether that be justice or aesthetics or bridges or gardens may lead us astray.
Right.
That's what I would call the Cartesian problem. That would, as if there's only one form that will do this property. It's how to balance or juggle these different concerns. But again, I see Hilla who's waving her hand.
No, yeah, waving is too much, but because there's also a question in the Q&A here, and I want to go back to that, the combination or connection between boldness and the humility that we need to work together. I'm also kind of like a broken record here. I do believe that unless we are willing to face justice from the negative side, from the underside of justice, and that is injustice, we will get nowhere, because we will have intellectual conversations, and that these don't get us anywhere. But the underside of justice, if that is injustice, brings us to the thick and thorny history of injustice. It's not that we do not need a concept of justice to define injustice. We all know that, but it brings us to the acknowledgement of what has gone wrong. What is the baggage that we carry with us? And I just, for me, this is actually personal and emotional, because, you know, to be honest, I came to the US 10 years ago, and I said to everyone who was skeptical that I would emigrate to the US and Germany, well, I'm going to Obama country. I had been in Boston during the Bush years, 2003 to 2005, and saw one election going that way. And I returned in 2010, and I was convinced I'm going back to Obama country. And then 2016 happened, and then 2021, January 6th happened. And so what is the baggage that we carry with us from here? It goes back to the whole history of the United States. And if I'm an immigrant, I bring my history with me. If I'm a Sikh, as my dear friend Valerie Kaur, who launched the Revolutionary Love movement, then you bring your Sikh history with you, and so on, you know. And I really, really believe that unless we have these honest conversations as part, not only of education, but as part of our willingness to acknowledge that our character is formed, our morality is continuously formed and reformed. Unless we acknowledge all that, we are going nowhere. And at the same time, I do believe that unless we set goals for actions, we also don't get anywhere.
I take, if I can just jump in, because I'd like to hear Tully on this, but what I heard him say is the relationship between humility and boldness.
Easy for you to say.
Yeah, right. Humility and boldness is very delicate, because if we don't put the requirement of a humble respect for others, but rather forefront the boldness of our own understanding of our quest for a particular conception of justice, we can cause as much trouble as if we were to fall into a quietism. Is that fair, Tully, or not?
Yeah, and I think my understanding of this prompt for this particular panel was, we seem to be caught in this kind of liberal conservative impasse, and what can interfaith education do to get beyond it? And maybe I'm misinterpreting the prompt itself, but as I understand, and I could be wrong on this. My sense is that, my sense is that, the kind of aesthetic of red hats that Nicole was talking about, there's something that binds, I think, that group, And even though there is a kind of new ecumenism where they seem to form alliances where they wouldn't otherwise, and where some actually think that the other is going to go to hell, even though they're now forming alliance over certain social issues. I mean, I think there's a way of seeing, there's just a way of seeing faith as a zero-sum game. And
but it's also, I'm sorry.
No,
please.
It's also what allows us to transcend, right? That faith is also that which allows us to see our connectedness to the universe in ways that, see beyond ourselves.
Right, and perhaps maybe a response is indicating that I'm not clearly expressing that I agree with you.
I know you do.
Right, so I guess
that.
I agree with you. I'm trying to, and it's just that to kind of shift the focus somehow to away from issues, so to speak, but to see that in fact, faith is a becoming. Faith is a set of practices. Faith, and I think that would just, open up a space to encounter difference, otherness, see similarities, see analogies, see to affirm irreducible differences. But at the same time, kind of walk in a certain kind of confidence of that I'm becoming something. I'm becoming that which my faith tradition says I can become, which mine says you can become God. And so, I'm just, and maybe I'm just being naive. Maybe I'm just being.
What? I would add an interfaith. Yeah. Interfaith cultivates empathy. Right? Faith cultivates this journey you're talking about, and interfaith cultivates empathy.
One would hope. Because
that's its design, right?
It's not cultivating empathy with the Russian Orthodox Church and the evangelical Christians. I can tell you that. But one would hope.
That's interfaith activism, which is different than interfaith activism.
Yeah. May I continue that line? Because my real question to you as Americans is, are you able to have conflictual conversations? Because I have conversations. People always accuse me. You try to say no. You jump into that. You're not afraid of having a fight or something like that. And I believe in conflictual conversations. I really believe in them because that's the only way, Bill, to negotiate kind of the commonality and the difference. One can do that respectfully, that is clear. But nevertheless, I must be willing to go into a conflict. So my question to you is, are you even able to this?
Yes.
From your formation history?
It's the backbone of liberal democracy. From in our founding fathers and debate in order to attain, or you can find it in John Stuart Mill, it's everywhere in our culture. Pragmatism could be understood as this. Now, whether or not in our polarized context we have the courage individually, but I also want to make one last
and the civic skills to do it civilly.
Yes.
Right. And the empathy to believe that I can condemn your ideas without having contempt for you as a person.
Right. And yes. I need to turn this over to Professor Otten, who's going to allow the audience to get in, unless she directs me. This is a fabulous conversation, so I don't mean to arbitrarily cut it off, but I was told to cut it off at 5 o'clock.
Than we had envisaged, but it was a very animated discussion. So these questions are meant to continue, allow you to continue that. So here's a question from Robin Loven that I'll pose to you, who says, and I think it builds up on this notion of conflict also. One problem for interfaith formation is that in our polarized society, faith communities seem to be sorting themselves out along more narrow lines that reflect political and social beliefs. How do our educational institutions and the forms of religious leadership for which we prepare people help us to deal with this fragmentation along social lines within and between our communities? So in a way, I think I see that question is how do you prevent conflict from become fragmentation and no longer then allow for conversation?
Well, I think there's another presupposition there, and it's actually one I'd respond to Hilla briefly, which may shock everyone here. I don't consider myself first and foremost an American. I consider myself first and foremost a Christian. And I take it that what Lovin is getting at is that we've allowed political differences to fragment the possibility of conversation among the religions. And the more contested the political, then the more contested the religious.
It's created a realignment.
Huh?
It's created a realignment. So
Yeah.
the progressive Jews and the progressive Christians and the progressive Muslims and the progressive Sikhs,
That's right.
we can all get together.
Yes.
And then the conservative ones can also bridge,
together.
as we talked about earlier, for political purposes.
Yeah.
But
Hilla,
how do we deal with that?
must say,
It reminds me just of something that came up in the opening panel with Ibu Patel, where he said that he was in Washington, not realizing that he was in a hotel with a lot of people for the March for Life, right? And he said that was kind of an interfaith discussion or get together with conservative Mormons, conservative Catholics. And so it was precisely what Rachel was saying, this realignment. But if you keep realigning without crossing bridges, you don't have interfaith discussion. I mean, you're all doing it within your little niche, but the goal of the idea is sort of thwarted, right? So how do you prevent that compartmentalization, say, of interfaith discussion?
Well, I actually think that part of our responsibility as educators is to equip students to navigate difference and conflict. And to do it well. One of my favorite interreligious tools for this is the Pluralism Project's case study collection, because they're taking instances where often everybody's there wants it to work, right? There's nobody who's trying to throw a bomb into the interfaith space, but there are irreducible differences that sometimes mean it's hard to navigate public space together, or some aspect of public religion. And so, you have to unpack that and figure out what's our stake and what are the tools for navigating that. And I love exposing students to this tool to make them better at navigating conflict.
I would add to that it's necessary, this might sound too simple, but hear me out, to get everyone and keep everyone in the same room. And one of the challenges that I've had teaching at UVA, I teach a course for first-year students called Religion, and this year was the 2020 elections. And that class has drawn a very diverse group of students typically, although it didn't this year. We were all Democrats this year. I have no idea why, but in the past it's drawn about half Republicans, half Democrats of all different, kind of commitments within the class. But one year there was a student, he was very politically conservative and very religiously conservative, evangelical. And I wouldn't blame my class necessarily, but he transferred to Liberty University at the end of the semester, which, again, I think we should, I want to be in conversation with people from Liberty University. I'm married to an evangelical, so my father-in-law earned an online degree from Liberty, so I automatically am, just by virtue of my situation in the world. But I was very disappointed because losing that student meant that we lost the opportunity to ask him questions. And so I think to this point that you've made, Bill, about humility, adding, and I don't want to go too far with this because some of my progressive cohorts would, be frustrated with me, but also some hospitality. What does hospitality look like without becoming a doormat where anything goes, while we still hold religious truth claims, but also allow space for people to authentically express what they believe and why they believe it within a space? I think that's an increasing challenge everywhere in every educational setting, but I've definitely found that within my public university education setting.
I just wanted to, not that we want to occupy the whole time to that question, but for me, I don't know, I believe in concretizations or so, and I believe that apart from the fragmentation that we see in the country, we do have sites where that fragmentation is overcome. And I've been running a project for a long time in medical ethics and healthcare. Chaplaincy. Chaplaincy is not the right word anymore. Is it spiritual care? Is that a kind of a relativistic term, or what is it really? And there you have negotiations, conflictual or not, how to create a space that is respectful of the plurality of religions, at the same time, however, really not serving just the representatives of the religions or faith traditions, but doing what these spaces are meant to be, kind of oases or retreats for people who are dealing with sickness, maybe even with death, themselves or their loved ones and so on, and create the space within a hospital which is dramatic, but which connects everyone who goes into that space. Yeah. And so I believe that rather than speaking of the political fragmentation, political theology, theological fragmentation, maybe we should learn from the negotiations and the experiences of such sites. You could go to prisons the same way, but hospitals, because it's so basic, so anthropological, that we experience there, maybe that is a better site to learn from the people who have dealt with and are dealing with religious pluralism to overcome the fragmentation.
So if I may go to another question from Pavlo Smitsnyuk, going back to Martin Luther King, and I thought that might be interesting. He says, King is a sign of the power of joint interreligious fight for justice and rights. It would seem, however, that some kinds of social cooperation are a way of sublimation of a proper theological dialogue between religions and churches, or, which is even worse, identification with ideologies. My question is how to avoid interfaith dialogue from allowing itself to be instrumentalized by ideologies.
So I would complicate the premise a little bit, I think. I believe that there are many entrances into interreligious studies and engagement, and that work in the world together, which might be driven by, I wouldn't call them ideologies, but rather moral commitments, is one entry point. Dialogue is another. It's another modality, and it has another purpose, right? Often that purpose is, perhaps it's still to improve the world, but it's to improve the world by improving my understanding of somebody else's commitment to their faith and the way they live it in the world. And I think that the main technique to not have, let one muddy the other is to be very clear in whatever kind of engagement it is, whether it be in the arts or it be dialogue or it be justice work in the world or any of another dozen entry points for interreligious work, that we're clear about the goals.
It seems to me that one needs to be very realistic about the drive of groups to sublimate others into themselves. This is the reality of power in social organizations. And whether we like it or not, the religions exercise an immense amount of power. And one has to be very concrete and realistic about that drive, I think, within every social organization. It's what we're working against constantly if we want some matter of equality and justice.
Well, even when we don't see that there's, an active agenda at work, there's social power at play.
Absolutely.
And we're arguing that we should need to be acutely aware of social power, which plays into religious and interreligious space in huge ways. I mean,
and our own use of it for our own purposes. So
I mean, we have, in my humble opinion, we have an example of, I call it an ideological interfaith movement to when we look at the use of religious freedom in the political sphere right now. And it is truly interfaith. It is truly meant to secure some privileges of labor rights, for example, or sexual morality, and so on. But it is, in my view at least, it is really instrumentalized for ideological purposes, and it is truly interfaith. And there, what Nicole said about the aesthetics and how aesthetics cannot be just embraced uncritically, I would think that any interfaith movement or interfaith conversation or whatever, of course, needs critical scrutiny, of course. On the other hand, one should not underestimate. One goes into conversations perhaps with an ideological lens, because we all have our biases and prejudices, but we should not underestimate that we could be changed by these encounters. Yeah.
I would also suggest that some things that present themselves as interfaith, because we're all operating in a context of Christian privilege, really aren't, it's the way people throw around Judeo-Christian as if they didn't really mean Christian, right? And it's a co-opting of the Judeo to make it sound like it's pluralistic when really they're talking about Christian values. So when you have, some Orthodox day schools join a suit, or Orthodox synagogues, to join a suit against public safety, we're really it's still a case for Christian privilege, even though they got, some Orthodox synagogues to go in with them.
So here's a question now about truth from Chris Durante. And we had that discussion a bit at the beginning. When truth is thought of as a fact that can be grasped cognitively, we tend to think that one of two opposing truth claims must invalidate the other. Is part of the problem that many religious thinkers have tended to understand truth as an epistemological category? Must we only conceptualize truth in epistemological terms? Considering that the Greek word aletheia can be translated as uncovering or even unfolding, it raises the idea that truth itself is a process. To this end, can we rethink truth as an ontological category? Can this help interfaith and intercultural education and dialogue by speaking to the ways in which we live and encounter one another, rather than what propositions we believe or assert?
Since I brought this up, can I respond quickly? I think maybe something that Hilla would also agree with. This depends on how you define religion. And I think religion is primarily practical. It has to do with a way of conducting life. It may have epistemic and metaphysical and cosmogonic elements to it, and religious thinkers are interested in unfolding those, but all of that, I still think, is finally about, this might be Telly's point as well, about forming a way of life, how to be in the world. The sense the deepest problem human beings face is, how should we live? It's not scripted for us, and the religions are attempts to answer that. So we could talk then about moral truth, aesthetic truth, epistemic truth, metaphysical truth. I'm not sure how much the aletheia discourse gets one, particularly in this practical realm. but I really think it depends on, and we haven't done this yet in this panel, what do we mean by religion? I think it's they are practical human civilizational forces shaping how people think they should live.
Yeah, and this is where I think an interfaith, I mean, okay, so again, there are those who truth is truth, and if I accept that, that can't be truth. So there's this kind of principle of non-contradiction, right? Always functioning with people and with many people. And I guess, but a good theology of God, and I'm going to say good because there are bad theologies of God. I'm sorry, there are, but a good theology of God, and now we're also seeing, to some extent, postmodern discourse converging in a way that there is a sense in which we're always oriented, towards something which is beyond us, something which is transcendent, to the idea that somehow we can capture that in some kind of conceptual framework and that's ideology, in my opinion. That's idolatry, and that's ideology. That's idolatry and ideology, right? So some kind of interfaith education, I think, to some extent has to, again, I'm sorry, it's not like a broken record, but to problematize that, right? And to realize that one can have a certain confidence, I guess, that they're moving in the right direction, obviously having a sense of truth about that, but that there has to be, getting back to Bill's original point in the beginning, a certain kind of epistemic humility that's called for both by, at least I would guess, from theologies of all religious traditions. I know some religious traditions don't use the word theology, but for heuristic purposes, theologies of all religious traditions, and again, a certain kind of conversion with postmodern discourse. There's a wonderful book that speaks about this convergent very recently, David Neuheiser's book on negative political theology, I think, which can be very useful for this kind of conversation and for thinking about this kind of interfaith education. All this to make the basic point that interfaith education can problematize truth by drawing on, I think, more mystical traditions, which always, to some extent, saw that you can never really capture and conceptualize God. And I think that opens up then people to otherness and difference, and it gets them away from zero-sum game thinking. By the way, just to this, to fill this awkward pause, but just to this, Vladimir Ilosky, a very famous Orthodox theologian, had a wonderful phrase where he said, with dogma, you just kind of have to just say enough, because in the end, the goal is to live the dogma.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very nice, it says a lot there about language and epistemic truth and all that kind of stuff. I think that was a very lovely phrase.
Right, it's comparable to Herman Dadine's truths to live by. I think the question actually articulated very nicely some of what you were saying at first, Telly, around confidence in what the journey of faith will help you to become and to live as into the world. And so I thought it was a nice way of thinking about it. And I love to deconstruct the original meanings of Greek terms just to trouble what we assume everything means, right? Not because it's going to be all answered. So for instance, Origen talks about heresy, right? Not as what we now think of as heresy, but as choice, right? Again, going back to Attic Greek. So I think it's a helpful exercise to reimagine, what it is we can help each other to become an interreligious space.
So here's a question about solidarity and the role of solidarity in interfaith education. What types of solidarity are scholars and practitioners in now, especially in the context of pluralism? what are possibly existing ways to integrate beliefs or thoughts with action in a whole at the individual, communal, national, and global level?
I would like to speak to that a little bit, because it it allows me to make the point I care so much about, that at the end of the day, the moral formation is not only about self-becoming, it is, I hope, at least oriented towards practice or towards actions. And the actions, or the goals for the actions, the goods we strive for, are defined in a good part by the historical situation, the historical time, and the location we are in. And that is why we all need to attend to what is going wrong, where do we come from, and where do we want to go to. And right now, I think solidarity to go into the etymology also, I would say there is binding together, the commonality, the binding together, the going together, the sharing of goals among people who strive for the same goals. But also, my mentor has called that the solidarity, but there's also the solidarity, which is more aligned with advocacy and so on. Right now, I do believe it is pretty easy to set some goals. Climate change is the very first one that we need to be solidaric about in our different positions, locations, and in our different capabilities. And I do believe that because we're talking about or in the midst of the pandemic, I do believe that the notion of global justice, as huge as it is, cannot be taken off the table either. And global justice is at the same time local justice. And every decision we make, even the decision how to distribute the vaccines and so on, is that driven by justice, or is that driven by I don't know, each country goes first or something like that. Yeah, and these discussions are very concrete and very easily entering into the thorny questions of how far does our solidarity really go.
One of the reasons. Go ahead, Bill.
I was going to say that it's a pointed question that I think, if, at least in my experience, there hasn't been a lot of interaction between academics and practitioners. Maybe that's not the case in other traditions. I think that American religiosity has moved increasingly in anti-intellectualist directions, cloistering themselves off. For those of us, I mean, CTS is a little bit different, as you noted at the beginning, Rachel, on this. I work at my church downtown as a theologian in residence, but these are things that scholars have to sort of pick up on their own. That's one of the important things about this panel and about this series of lectures, because too much we're cloistered off. Either we're told that the academy doesn't really have anything to do with real life, or if you're going to speak to real life, don't speak like an academic. And that leads to a kind of mutual suspicion that I think has been extraordinarily corrosive.
I actually see perhaps the beginning of reversals of some of those trends. There's an increase in young scholars seeing themselves as scholar activists.
I didn't say
the demise of
a whole nother problem.
But and therefore religious scholars also being part of their activism is inside religious communities. But I just lost my train of thought. I'm
sorry.
Oh, it's okay. And various, oh, I know, the demise of the ability to have a life in the academy is one of the things that's contributing to it, right?
Yeah.
In the humanities, as people have to reimagine, because there aren't as many lovely, comfy tenure track positions, you know, how are you going to do your work and make your mark in the world, and where are you going to locate yourself? Means that scholars are locating themselves in diverse places. And there are also some efforts, especially with the demise of the religion reporter, to get scholarly or at least well-informed voices into the media space when it comes to religion. So there are some of the efforts that I think are trying to, again, bridge those worlds.
Good.
I thought maybe, Nicole, you could speak to that also, since you are an early career scholar, so to speak. So I think you're maybe more aware of that, of the changing landscape. Do you sense a shift, as Rachel said?
Yes, but I'm not sure it's necessarily a good thing for either scholarship or activism, if I'm being honest. I was in the activist world all the way in, and I left it because there are ways of framing questions and making arguments that aren't necessarily compatible with the work of activism. And I'm not sure that's a bad thing. When I think about solidarity, I think Hilla was doing a really good job of kind of like thinking through how things, you know, how people and communities are connected. And I think solidarity, the pursuit of solidarity, need not undermine difference or distinction between things. I would say I'm a scholar and I'm an activist. And sometimes those things have a lot to do with each other, and sometimes they have almost nothing to do with each other. And I think, especially being here in Charlottesville and seeing some of the ways that scholars have been involved negatively and have negatively impacted the work of grassroots organizers on the ground, I think treading carefully is important. But I know that a lot of people would not agree with me about that in my generation. But I think I have the perspective of being in both, but also, we haven't talked a lot about race in this conversation, being tagged as both necessarily because of my race and ethnicity. Oh, you're Mexican American, you must also always be in the activist mode and never in the scholar or fully in the scholar mode. And when you are, we're going to assume that you're just, speaking as an activist. So I think it's a really troubled ground. But interestingly enough, I think thinking through carefully about how we understand solidarity, you can tell that I really love definitions. How we define and specify solidarity can help us to think about ways to improve relationships between those communities, and might also have insights for how different religious communities interact with each other as well.
May I just say something that just...
But I think on that note, since we are reaching the end of the conversation, I would actually like to invite
Invite who?
Noah Silverman was going to come on and end the conversation, but I don't see Noah yet. So Hilla, go ahead.
Oh, there he is.
Noah, there you are.
Hi, everyone. Yes, unfortunately, we are at the end of our time for this webinar, although there's obviously lots more to say. I want to thank all of our panelists for what was truly a very thought-provoking and inspiring and very appropriate conversation for Martin Luther King Day. I know that there's a lot that I'm going to be chewing on and thinking about for days and weeks to come. Though this conversation is coming to a close, the symposium will continue. So we have 2 more webinars coming up this week. On Wednesday, we will have a webinar with a panel of seminary and div school administrators reflecting on the future of divinity and seminary education in a post-COVID world. And then the following day, Thursday the 21st, we'll have a panel of younger and emerging scholars reflecting on their perspectives on the symposium's theme. Both of those will be at 4 p.m. Central Time, and you can register for them in the same place you did for this one. Again, thank you to all of our panelists and to Wilhelmine and all the other organizers for their thoughts and their insights and for the wisdom that they imparted. And I look forward to continuing the conversation later this week. Thank you very much and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.